Contamination. Jonathan Bartell Space Agent. Written and narrated by Patty Jansen. Chapter 1. Jonathan inspected the buttons of his brand new uniform. Check. The Velcro straps on his shoes. Check. His shirt being tucked in. Check. And his name badge on the pocket of his shirt. Check. He knocked on the door with a sign that said D. White, and underneath that, Orbital Launch Station Quarantine Officer. Somewhere inside the room, a female voice said, "Come in." Jonathan pressed his hand against the metal panel on the door. The tiny light next to the panel flashed green, and the door rumbled aside. He stepped into the tiny office and felt like he was pushed sideways. He almost tripped and most unceremoniously landed into the chair opposite Dana White's desk. She looked at him over the rim of her reading glasses. Her hair was cropped short, with the pepper and salt curls cropped close to her head. "I didn't say you could sit down." Her severe face was lit from below by her computer screen. Her expression held not a shred of humor. Sorry." He scrambled up, trying to keep his balance, but a little voice in his head kept telling him that he was on an invisible bus rumbling down an invisible street, and that, at any time, the bus might swerve or stop. That said, he'd been feeling a lot better than on the shuttle. That had been plain awful, but still, artificial gravity didn't have a blip on the real thing, and trying to walk inside a bike tube that was spinning at 3.5 rotations a minute was an acquired skill. A skill that all those people in the Orbital Launch Station corridors had acquired, but he had, evidently, not, and that made him the butt of jokes. He clutched his pad harder, determined not to stumble, or worse, run off in search of a place to bath. That would never do, facing a woman who was his new boss and old enough to be his mother. "Sit down, Mr. Bartell." Jonathan sat down again, in the same chair, looking at her wrinkled hands. In space, fluids tended to accumulate in the body's extremities, and she should look less old than on Earth. On second thoughts, maybe she was old enough to be his grandmother. "Did you sleep well, and are you rested enough to start your job?" "Yes." And because yes alone was such a lonely word, he added, "Ma'am," and then, because she was not military, he thought that was probably the wrong thing to say. She laughed. "You're very green, right?" "Arrived yesterday." "So I've heard," with a ghost of a smile on her face. Jonathan cringed. Who had been spreading the story about him having his face buried in a bath bag for almost the entire journey? You know what happens when you bath in 0G? She turned to her computer and flicked through a couple of screens. "You're a biologist by training?" "Exo-biologist." He tried to sit in whatever felt the best definition of straight to him. She rose and started rummaging in drawers set in the back wall of the tiny office. A memory crossed his mind. It had been yesterday, or whatever passed for yesterday, UTC, before boarding the shuttle. He sat in the shuttle departure hall, amongst passengers waiting to be led aboard the shuttle. Half of the passengers were military people of the shoulder-clapping, "we'll get the fucking bastards" type. Friendly enough, in a threatening, look-at-my-muscles sort of way. He hadn't really wanted to talk to any of them, but this buff dude in full uniform, with a few decorations and polished buttons, had asked him if he was going up to the station, which Jonathan said he was, and then he'd asked what Jonathan's field of work was. Upon hearing of Jonathan's degree, Mr. Shiny Buttons said, "So, we discover a few microbes on some god-forsaken planet, and 4 years later we've got space-fucking biologists coming out of our ears. I hear some have to work in fast food joints. Space biology, huh?" pretty much a decent assessment of the truth, and also a real damper on the prospect of intelligent in-flight discussion. The 5-hour flight was about to get boring. A bit later, one of the other military guys sat next to him on the flight while waiting for takeoff. He asked, "I just heard you talking to Cresswell back there on the surface. Space biologist, huh? What are you going to do up at the station?" Work for the quarantine authority?" Everyone had looked at him as if he was something stuck to the bottom of their shoe, and they had treated him like that for the rest of the flight. Quarantine authority was obviously the wrong answer. By the looks on their faces, it was possibly even worse than exo-biology. Obviously, the point of the quarantine authority was to stand in the military's way and make their jobs harder with annoying forms and regulations. Pardon the sarcasm. Jonathan jolted when Dana White held a data pad under his nose, a thin model, flexible screen. "This will be yours. It contains all the netware you need to perform your job as quarantine officer. Read all of it through carefully. Come to me if you have any questions." He took the pad. "Is there going to be any on-the-job training?" "This is the training. The job is simple. You check the forms that each ship will have completed and sent ahead. If they haven't sent it, you get the captain or a representative to fill it out. The pad contains the checklists of things you need to look at. Make sure all the fields are filled in for each of the crew members and that the captain of each ship signs off on it. I'd walk you through, but it's insanely busy and we've got a lot of unhappy captains out there because of the new regulations that came out of the Mars case. You know about that, right?" Jonathan nodded. The settlement of Newton had been a case study in his last year of his degree. It consisted of a couple of dome-based or underground habitats, interlinked by tunnels for vehicular transport. Population 4,000. Those who predicted Mars would harbour bacterial life had been right. Those who said that that life would be too alien to affect humans had been wrong. Requirement number 1 for survivability of alien life: a fluid, usually water. When microbes entered water, they multiplied. When humans drank the water, they got sick. Fortunately, it had only been a gastrointestinal illness, and fortunately, the source had been found and eliminated, but not before a lengthy and costly lockdown of the base, all its people, and a moratorium on visitors. Dana White met his eyes. "At the Quarantine Authority, we are the first line of control against alien organisms. We've recently had to tighten the rules about ships entering Earth space without checks. As of now, they all have to come in here before we clear them to go into a lower orbit. If they fail the tests, we can investigate immediately. Make sure no ship leaves the station without having done the administration, made the declarations, and passed the 3-point test." Jonathan flicked through his documents and found lists of checkpoints and a form with 3 questions. It looked pretty straightforward. All right, he could do that. He was about to get up when a question came to mind. "What should I do when someone fails the test?" "If they fail 1 question, use your judgment. If they fail more, you refer the case to me. But honestly, by the time a ship arrives here, they will have already sent us their details, so you'll find a lot of sections of the application have already been approved. We will know where they have been. You'll find that in the logs. The military ships provide less information, as you will appreciate, but they have assigned on-board quarantine officers who send us the forms. The smaller ships will have filed their information with the central quarantine log, and our other staff will have approved it. There is not that much to the job, apart from making sure that the information is correct and logged for the right ship. Read through the files. It's all self-evident, and someone as smart as you should have no trouble following the instructions." Was that a barb? All right. He rose and managed to negotiate the room without tripping or falling over. "And, Mr. Bartell." "Yes." He turned back to her, his hand on the door handle. There was a grin on her face. "You can stop leaning sideways now." Chapter 2. Jonathan was furious. So they thought it was amusing, right? Let's poke this young upstart with a stick until he pops. Just like those idiots on the flight yesterday, sticking their heads together and laughing and talking, after they had all heard he was a biologist working for the Quarantine Authority. They thought he wouldn't know they were making stupid jokes about him. They were just dumb. It was always the same. People laughed at him all the time. "You're not much," they would say, or call him a midget, or think he was a kid. He'd get overlooked in shops and ignored in the company of others. Well, he had a surprise for them. He was not going to crumble, not for his boss and not for any military hotshot. People had called him names all his life. He was used to it. And he'd do this stupid job without proper training and without complaint. And he'd do it well, no matter that nobody seemed to want him here. While walking to the docking section, he looked through the documents on the data pad. He kept his noble intentions and a straight back for all of 5 seconds. Forms, forms, and more forms. "In the job, you will have some use for your biology knowledge," that daft launch station recruiter had said in Jonathan's first interview for the job. That had to be a joke. The only biological knowledge he needed to fill out forms was how to use the muscles for holding a pen. Seriously, this looked like it would be the most boring job ever, with no friends and no support, surrounded by people obsessed with muscles and military brawn and nowhere to escape. He'd signed up for a minimum of 2 years, and they looked like they would be the longest years in his life. What had he done? Not listen to his father, that was what. Before leaving, he'd spoken to his dad on the phone to say goodbye and maybe to get some last words of advice about the Orbital Launch Station, where his father had worked for many years. "Going into space, huh?" his father had snorted. Jonathan could imagine his father sitting at the dining table while admiring his collection of ancient coins. "That's what I always wanted." "Well, son, better you than me." "I was wondering if you have any last-minute advice." He'd hoped his father would be proud for once, or tell his son he was happy even if he wasn't, or say anything useful that didn't involve bitter complaints. But he guessed it was too hard to teach an old dog new tricks, as the saying went. "I don't understand you, son. After all the warnings I gave you, you still want to go." "I do." And those warnings had been either too specific, such as avoid this, probably long since retired person, or too vague to apply. The authorities his father had mentioned were no longer in existence. People had left. Rules were no longer the same. For example, members of the Quarantine Authority no longer needed to sign up for the military, and, as Jonathan remembered, it was the military that was the source of a lot of his father's displeasure. There was a small silence. "What does your mother say about it?" "She's happy for me." Small lie, but not one his father would find out about. Jonathan had only met his dad a few times recently, since he got his scholarship and moved back into his mother's house. He could not possibly tell him of the discussions with her about his future across the dinner table. "That man left me for months at a time to look after you and the house and the bills alone, and then, whenever he was back for Earth leave, he'd demand that I run for him at his beck and call. I do not want you to become like that." She was crying, but then again she always did that, making him feel guilty for nothing other than simply existing. Truth was, probably his mother had already grown tired of the marriage by the time his father had gone into space. She could have gone with him. These days, entire families went to the colonies, but she probably couldn't stand any person making demands on her. She preferred ordering other people around. Was there a name for the emotion you felt when you realized, as an adult, that neither of the parents to whom you looked up in childhood were nice people? Jonathan had certainly decided that he was not going to get married. He'd be happy to leave home. And he didn't know why this lousy relationship with his father should bug him so much. After all, his father had been military and, as he had confirmed for himself, the military hated exo-biologists. The single ring of the Orbital Launch Station consisted almost entirely of docking space for vessels. 1/4 of it was taken up by surface-to-orbit shuttles, but most of the space was reserved for the behemoths of deep space, clunky square things of huge mass, powered by reactors that were usually serviced at the station. That had been his father's last job. Before that, he'd been a nuclear scientist for the Space Corps. There were plenty of people about in the gravity-curved passage where Jonathan walked, clutching his pad. Walking was quite easy, as long as he didn't turn his head while doing it. It felt like walking on a travelator. Piece of cake. The large ships did not hard dock, but matched their speed with the station and used anchoring cables and flexible access tubes, plus power and fuel umbilicals. Each of those access tubes had its own airlock, with a display panel on the wall next to it. This panel took its information straight from the ship, including readiness, crew and passenger number, type, designation, engine type and origin or nationality of its main registrant, if a private ship. Yes, there were mass-born people starting up businesses now, but the vast majority of the ships were military. Jonathan passed one military ship after another, all idling at 5% readiness, all with 1 or 2 crew members standing guard outside the tube, as idle as the ship's engines. They eyed Jonathan from the corners of their eyes, faces full of suspicion when they spotted his quarantine authority badge. They were impatient, waiting to get out system, waiting to disembark their crew on leave, waiting to be assigned a lower orbit or waiting for the OK to travel on to other stations. He took his pad and brought up his list of ships. A couple had been marked grey as in progress, so someone else was processing them. White had said nothing about colleagues, but he presumed there were some. It would have been nice to have been introduced. Heavens, had some of these ships been hanging around here for as much as a week? The first ship, which had been here for 10 days, was a small merchant vessel that had arrived from one of the industrial stations in the asteroid belt and was bound for Lunar Station. The captain, a belligerent man looking like a sumo wrestler, complained loudly about the wait. He asked to see the supervisor, but he passed the 3-point test, and Jonathan recommended that he be approved to leave. The next ship was a small military vessel that had been doing maintenance on satellites, and was also cleared. Then he approved a military ship that, like other large military vessels, had already been approved for a lower orbit than the station, and would send its own shuttles from there once it left the dock. The captain made no secret that he thought the requirement for them to come into the launch station was ridiculous. "It only clogs up your process as well. We have onboard testing. We can send you all the data you need electronically." Jonathan told the captain about the need for personal checks if a ship failed the questions, and that they would need to remain at the station and were not allowed to mingle with station crew until they were cleared. The captain grumbled about bureaucracy, but signed all the forms. Hey, this job was okay, after all. Chapter 3. Jonathan came across the military vessel SS Everbright just before his lunch break. 2 military personnel in crisp uniforms were the only evidence that hinted at the behemoth on the other side of the access tube. The display screen next to the door blazed SS Everbright, crew 1041, 8% readiness, So, they were impatient, right? Revving up the engines and way down the queue to be processed. Arrived only yesterday, full of military personnel. This was the first really large ship that he had processed. Dana White had said that they should have sent pathology details to the base, but he couldn't see anything listed in the box where those details had been provided for the previous military ships. Jonathan went up to the tube. Both soldiers regarded him with icy looks. "My name is Jonathan Bartell from the Quarantine Authority. I need to complete some formalities. I need your captain or representative of the captain to sign a declaration." "Yes, sir," one of the men said. "The captain, sir. The captain is very busy." "Or a representative?" "Yes, sir. Wait here, sir." He disappeared inside the tube. He could, of course, have offered to take Jonathan to the captain's representative, but he guessed that was out of the question. One thing he had learned so far was that the military were pretty precious about their ships. Jonathan waited, fiddling with his pad while eyeing the remaining soldier, who, in turn, glanced at him from the corner of his eye. According to the database, the Everbright was a logistics ship, strengthening the front line for an alien menace which the military said was coming closer into the solar system. A few years ago, military astronomers, mainly those stationed at Triton Base around Neptune, had identified several inbound objects moving towards the Sun. According to these military astronomers, the fact that these objects sent out radio waves of ever-decreasing frequency meant that they were artificial. At first, the Space Corps had been blasting communication at them, but there had been no reply. They had asked for massive increases in their funding in case the objects turned out to be hostile, and had gotten it. Some scientists were now starting to say that there were no approaching bogies and that the incoming objects had been artifacts of a mistake in calibration. They said that the failure of Space Corps to provide objective proof of the existence of these bogies was because the military wanted to ensure that their funding was maintained at the current level. Something was happening on the dock now. The single soldier at the tube entrance straightened, and the access tube to the Everbright moved with a rhythmic thud of footsteps. A moment later, the soldier reappeared in the company of a woman in military uniform with more service decorations on her pocket than there was space for. Wow. Jonathan nodded. How did one greet military hotshots? "You're Captain Farrell of the military vessel Everbright?" She was a stout woman, shorter than him, with a round face and short, spiked-up hair. "Yes, what's up?" She glanced at the board next to the door. "If our name on there gets any brighter, it'd be visible on the damn surface of the damn Earth." Jonathan ignored her jibe. She hadn't needed to come herself. She could have asked one of the staff to do this for her. "I need you to complete and authorize these forms." He held the pad under her nose. She frowned. "What for?" "You need to make a quarantine declaration prior to entering Earth space, madam. Station regulations." "Quarantine regulations? The fuck? We have onboard pathology." "I know that, madam," he swallowed, "but I don't have those results." "Then ask the station management for the results. We sent them." "Sure, madam. I still need you to complete and sign a declaration." Her eyebrows bristled with a frown. "Declaration?" Behind him, a couple of the tech crew walked along the dock, and they glanced at his pad, then at him, raising their eyebrows. "This is a new regulation, you know, since that scare we had with native bacteria on Mars." He was melting under her gaze. "No, I don't know." "The native microorganisms contaminated the water source and caused the entire population to suffer gastro. I only ask you a few questions. It won't take long." "Well, it had better not. I don't care about the bowels of the colonists on Mars." She took the pad from his hands. A button on the screen said "Begin procedure," so she pressed that, casually, with her thumb, flicking her eyebrows in a "look at me, I'm doing your stupid questionnaire" gesture. Jonathan did his best not to squirm. He didn't think he was successful. She had to be twice his age, twice his width, and twice his experience. She was asked for her ID and designation. She entered that. That brought up the first question, which she read aloud. Have you or anyone in your vessel had contact with an alien body, including, but not limited to, a planet, an asteroid, an artificial satellite not installed by your vessel on the current trip? She snorted. Hell yeah. How about made out for Europa to investigate a signal coming in from under the ice, but were disturbed by an emergency beacon, pushed onto Titan, rescued locals from impending freezing to death by realigning their solar reflection mirrors, stopped on the way out from Saturn to take in some ice from the rings. Young man, sometimes you people here seem to forget that something out there is trying to push into the solar system. They don't listen to our communication, don't reply to anything, and we won't rest until the bastards are defeated. Her eyes met Jonathan's, and he felt like it was his father looking out through them. A military man who never had much truck with all this touchy-feely bacteria stuff. She pressed next. Do you think I've wasted the past few months with silly questionnaires about the bowels of the Mars colonists? She read out the next question, too. Have you or any of your party been ill during the voyage? An illness includes anything more serious than a common cold. Again, a snort. Geez, what do you think? We've been away for months. We've been to Lunar Base. You know how bad the military mess is at Lunar Orbital? Food poisoning guaranteed. They don't call it Shitsville for nothing. She turned her attention back to the pad and read, Have you or any of your party taken material from foreign bodies you visited? A sigh of exasperation. What do you people think we do when we go out on logistics operations? Sit in the ship and look at things? Oh, that's a pretty moon going past. Let's take a picture. Taking pictures is something NASA did 100 years ago. Remember NASA? Never got anywhere just taking pictures. No, we actually do stuff. We salvage things. We attach things and launch things. And fix things if needed. We've dug holes, attached cannons, installed laser-guided missiles. Of course we've taken back material. Who has ever come away from Titan without thol and crap all over their shuttles? She pressed the next button. The screen flashed with the text, Return to Supervisor. With a smirk, she gave the notepad back to Jonathan. Was that all? He looked at the screen. Failed all 3 questions. Miserably. His heart was thudding. What had gone from a boring job had suddenly become an unenviable job. He gathered the courage to meet her eyes. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't allow you to leave this station. Your staff need to report for testing and cannot be allowed in the station until they have been cleared. She stared at him. Her glare was like burning coals. Come again? His cheeks felt like they were on fire. I'm very sorry, ma'am, but anyone who answers positive to any 2 questions... The smile disappeared from her face. Listen, mister, she said. This is not some bureaucratic game. I have 1,000 soldiers aboard my ship. We've been away defending Earth's safety for a year and 5 months. We have an urgent medical case on board. A man is suffering multiple fractures to his leg, and we need to get home. Jonathan looked at his pad, as if that would change the damning replies. It didn't. He straightened his back. Those are regulations, ma'am. We don't want exobacteria reaching Earth. Then stick us into a decontamination room. But whatever you do, do it quickly. The captain looked displeased. Very displeased, in fact. It's not that simple, ma'am. The scientists have discovered... Scientists? Hell. We're the reason you're still here and you're still breathing. We're going home. You can't, I'm sorry. Your ship's socket will be locked and refueling procedures won't work. You need to decontaminate your entire crew and ship and stay here for a minimum of 12 weeks. You're fucking kidding. There's no way our crew member is going to wait that long for treatment. I'm not kidding. I'm sorry, she said softly. Who is your supervisor? Chapter 4. Feeling as if a huge thundercloud hung over him, about to start raining, Jonathan led Captain Farrell through the passage to Dana White's office. They walked along the dockside walkway, where tech crew and station supply crew mingled with ship crew, both military and civilian. Most of the umbilical tubes on both sides of the passage were in use, with names of ships blazing from the displays. Jonathan spotted a couple of other people from the quarantine authority with pads at ships' entrances. A rotund man with a moustache like a walrus shouted at a terrified young woman. 12 weeks? You cannot be serious. He spoke in a heavy Russian accent. The panel next to the tube said that the vessel on the other side was a Mars runner. Yes, with that origin, he would be out of luck. To get to the office, Jonathan had to bypass a queue of 5 or 6 people seated on a hard metal bench along the wall in the narrow passage that led to her door. They glanced at Jonathan and the quarantine authority patch on his shirt with hope in their eyes, faces weary and resigned to waiting here. Jonathan knocked on Dana White's door and opened it when she said, "Come in." She seemed surprised to see him. Jonathan said, "Captain Farrell of the military vessel Everbright to see you." Dana White's eyebrows rose. The captain said, "This man has told us that we need to stay here for 3 months. The ship has failed all 3 questions. Jonathan's voice sounded in his own ears like one of those dog toys that squeaked when chewed by the dog. Dana glanced from Jonathan to the captain. "Sit down, ma'am." The captain sat. "Sorry," Dana said, as if that explained the entire situation. "He's very keen." She cast a glance at Jonathan. The captain said, "Have quarantine regulations changed that much since we left?" They have. Unfortunately, the Orbital Transit Authority had to isolate Mars until the local population dealt with the native bacteria in their water supply. Nasty critters adapted to any disinfectant we throw at them. They even multiply like crazy under massive radiation. There is no way we want something like that to spread. The captain nodded. "This is one of the reasons why we keep pathology records on board." "I know. If you make them available to us, I think we can sort something out that will allow you to leave soon." "Thanks, I appreciate that." Dana glanced at Jonathan again. "You may wait outside, Bartell." There was no smile now. Jonathan went into the corridor where he sat on the hard metal bench next to the other people and waited. Those people were all filling out quarantine forms on their pads. As far as he could see, they were all crew from private vessels, dressed in a variety of outfits. He received a couple of curious glances, but no one said anything. He fiddled with the buttons on his uniform, wondering what he had done wrong. Exo-bacteria were serious business. The one strain at Mars might not have been very potent, but the danger out there was huge. During his course on Earth, Professor Ames showed him the work that the Martian scientists had done. It was an interesting pathogen, not unlike Earth bacteria, but with the ability to lie dormant and survive harsh conditions, such as temperature close to absolute zero and a hard vacuum, for millions of years, until a suitable host came along. His own work had been on tardigrades and multicellular organisms. Once people knew where to look, the abundance of organisms in space was astounding, and their similarity to some of those on Earth even more so. The door to Dana White's office opened, and Captain Farrell appeared in the doorway. Jonathan scrambled to his feet. "Thank you," she said in a cool manner, and strode off. "Jonathan, come in." Dana White's face looked like thunder. Jonathan went into the office and shut the door. He met Dana White's eyes. He shrugged. She failed the questions. The Everbright is a deep space military vessel. Of course they will fail the questions. I didn't know. You said when a ship failed the questions to come to you. And when she didn't reply, he added, I had no idea that the military gets special consideration. They have on-board pathology, she repeated, as if that solved all problems. Their results should be in your files, approved and all. Sorry, I looked, but I didn't see it, she snorted. She pushed her PCD across her desk and turned it so that the screen faced him. There, she pointed. The button says Attached Files. It did, too. How could he have missed that? Jonathan's ears glowed. This will go up to Major Kitchener, the boss of the Space Force unit at the station. Major Kitchener is not a patient man and he doesn't suffer fools. Sorry, I truly didn't know. He didn't think he'd been a fool. Overzealous and green, certainly, but not a fool. But the system will clear that up, surely. Clearly it was not that simple, but she wouldn't tell him why not. She only told him to check his fucking instructions and not to let it happen again. Jonathan wanted to ask her why the questionnaire existed then, if it was so clear that many ships would fail it. But she only had this to say. Remember this, Bartell. These guys put their lives on the line for us. If they didn't, I bet that we'd have our sorry asses busted out of here in no time. No matter what authorities down there on Earth say, we, at the station, exist to help the Space Force, not the other way around. Now, I'll give you a very quick lesson in self-preservation up here. You do not behave like an asshole. I don't care what else you do, but do not be an asshole. You understand that? No assholery. Chapter 5. Dinner at night was in the large station canteen. The rotational movement of the station made for a distinct lack of appetite, but Jonathan went there anyway, because he'd become sick of the rehashing of news on the in-house entertainment channel while sitting in the glorified cupboard that passed for a room. The news was all from Earth, several channels of it. Later in the afternoon, Jonathan had met some colleagues, and when they heard he was a recent arrival, they kept asking him for news. Why, if they got all the Earth news in the world? It was busy in the canteen, but the station's population was small enough that he already knew some faces. Closest to the serving counter was that group of military people who had come up on the shuttle with him, including that self-assured and obnoxious lout Cresswell, who had said, "We got space-fucking biologists coming out of our ears." Jonathan had learned that the bars on Cresswell's breast pocket meant he was in officer training. Obviously, he thought very highly of himself. While he walked across the room carrying his tray and looked for a place to sit, people glanced at him from the corners of their eyes. A rogue, new, green, impressionable quarantine officer. He felt like a kitten at a dog training session. Then someone called, "Hey!" It was a young woman he'd seen on the shuttle. To be honest, the one who had been handing him the bath bags. She was quite short, had short brown hair, clear brown eyes, and a determined face. She wore a military uniform with 2 stripes on her shoulders. He determined not to let that cloud his judgment of her. "Oh, hi. You look lost." He shrugged. He had met some colleagues, and he hoped to see some of them here so that he could introduce himself properly, but he hadn't spotted them yet in the sea of military. She patted the empty seat next to her. "You're not waiting for anyone?" "No." And after a small pause, "My colleagues are on duty." Jonathan sat, feeling awkward. A few people at surrounding tables gave them sideways glances. "I'm Gaby," she said. Her badge said Lieutenant Larsen. Jonathan Bartell. You work for the Quarantine Authority? Yeah, he nodded, unsure if working there was a good thing or a bad thing in her eyes. White's asshole lecture was still burning in his mind. Feel a bit better than yesterday? She grinned. Much better, thanks. They ate for a bit. She said, Heard you created a bit of a stir by stopping the Everbright being processed quickly. I was only doing my job according to the instructions I was given. No one said anything about... He stopped, noticing that a few people around them were listening. It was probably not such a good idea to talk about this in the middle of the canteen. Surely they'll clear things up soon. It was only a misunderstanding. He still didn't see what he had done wrong and how it could be a major problem. That misunderstanding will have been flagged to the authorities on Earth, Gaby said, her voice low. Every arrival to Earth goes through the shuttle port, where we also left to come here. Quarantine is meant to pre-vet the Earthbound crew and flag any for special attention. The bureaucrats there will expect extensive documentation with each flagged case. They'll have to hand in a detailed log of what the ship has done since leaving Earth. They'll have to detail localities. The Corps has no love for bureaucracy and never wants to make their localities public. That's more than 1,000 records that have just been created with a little mistake. 1,000 records that will take weeks to process, and some of the information is sensitive, so the Everbright is not going to want to part with it. Meanwhile, we got these angry people hanging around here, having initiated a process that no one can stop. Quarantine isn't military, so the Quarantine Authority on Earth will want to do their job properly. They have no love for the military way of bypassing their checks anyway. Crap, that sounded like a real hassle. Blood rose to his cheeks. You're very green, right? Ever been to space before? He shook his head, and for some reason added, My father has. She frowned at his name tag. I did notice your last name. You're not the son of Paul Bartell, are you? He nodded. There was a small silence, which he didn't like. He glanced over the heads of the seated people in the canteen. At the far end sat a large group of high-ranking military officers wearing nice suits, not the regular overalls. Captain Farrell was amongst them. She met his eyes and seemed to recognize him. Jonathan cringed. He asked Gaby, Do you know my father? Not personally, but he's got a bit of a reputation in the Corps. And then she added, before he could ask if it was a good or a bad reputation, You don't look like him. Jonathan shrugged, lost in the backhanded remarks and innuendo. Clearly, there was something he was missing. What sort of reputation? His father rarely spoke about his work, other than give him warnings that were outdated and sounded like an old man complaining. My parents divorced when I was little. I grew up with my mother and don't know my father very well. He's not an easy person to talk to. He wasn't sure why he said that. His awkwardness around his father had more to do with Jonathan himself than his father's character. No, I can imagine. And then she changed the subject. The most important thing to know about this place is that you should not confuse civilians and the military, because different rules apply to them. The civvies are meant to love and adore their military heroes. He glanced at her badge. But I'm a doctor, and I happen to work for the military. I'm not serving on a ship, but I work in the launch station's hospital. They don't consider me real military, even if officially I am. Oh. He glanced at Captain Farrell across the room. She was speaking to someone next to her. A doctor, huh? At the hospital? Then he got an idea. Do you help people on board the ships? If I've been requested to do so, yes. Because the captain of the Everbright said that she had a crew member with a broken leg who needed urgent medical attention. She frowned. Haven't heard of that case yet. Can I... He swallowed. Can I offer her your help? Sure, that's what I'm for. They will have medical personnel on board, but we have better equipment, and we can send any results straight to whatever hospital they want to go to on Earth. When Jonathan finished his dinner, Gaby showed him the bench at the far end, where people stacked their trays, plates, and discarded their rubbish. A stream of people filed out of the room and turned right into the corridor. Gaby said, You want to come? After dinner, most people who aren't on duty hang out in the rec room. We got movies, games, a library, a gym. Yeah, sure. But I want to do something else first. You go ahead. There's signs everywhere. It's not as if I'll get lost. She grinned and left. Jonathan gathered all his courage and went to the far side of the hall, to the table where Captain Farrell sat. Excuse me, ma'am. She turned around, frowned, and then her face cleared. Ah, yes, you're the shrimp from this morning. Yeah, well, she could always pretend that she had to think about it, to know who he was, just to impress his insignificance on him. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for... Why did he always become tongue-tied when someone higher in authority gave him the evil eye? I didn't know about the agreement you had with quarantine. I'm sorry, I only started working here today. I just wanted to... You have a point? Yes. The Orbital Launch Station has a doctor. She can treat your crew member. You know, the one you were talking about who broke his leg. She says they have better scanners in the hospital than you have on board, and she can send the results to any hospital on Earth so that they can look at them before you arrive. While he spoke, her expression went from belligerent to one of interest. When he finished, there was a small silence. Well, I actually like that idea. Chapter 6. Jonathan followed Gaby through the access tube that led from the dockside to the giant ship, wheeling a hospital trolley. Light was sparse in here, and the ground wobbled under his feet. The tube was flexible and, in a stationary position, the ship took its gravity from the station's rotation, so when they walked in the tube, and the tube swung, the direction of the gravity appeared to change. It made for a slightly nauseating experience. The flow of the air sounded really noisy here, or maybe the low rumbling noise came from the huge ship that was attached to the end of the tube. They met several military people coming the other way, and Jonathan did his utmost best not to stumble or lean on the trolley too heavily, and, with the uneven footing, that was a real feat. He had to admit to being excited. He'd read about the deep space cruisers many times, but he'd never hoped to board anything more than one of the behemoth ships that travelled the long routes to the outer solar system and back. His father had served on these ships before taking the position of nuclear engineer at the Orbital Launch Station. If his father only spoke rarely of the time at the launch station, he'd spoken even less of his time in the long-haul ships. The airlock of the Everbright stood open, a cubicle that would hold at least 10 people at full capacity. On the other side, a lift took them down to the deck below, deeper inside the ship. A spotless white corridor led in both directions. It had doors both in the walls and the floor, and even in a stationary position, with artificial gravity determined by the rotation of the station. The nauseating sense of directionlessness crept back into his subconscious. It was not a good feeling. A young soldier waited for them there, dressed in overalls, with a ship patch. The captain has told me to escort you to the hospital, ma'am. He frowned at Jonathan. Is this a nurse? Assistant, Gaby said. The man nodded at Jonathan, his gaze fixed on the name tag that said J. Bartell. He didn't say anything and didn't return Jonathan's smile. Jonathan was sure that he recognized the name, because it was not as if Bartell was such a common last name. Via a set of stairs they descended further into the ship. Jonathan had imagined a cramped grey interior like a submarine, but the Everbright had light-filled passages, bigger cabins and wider corridors than the launch station. For one, it was much newer, but also bigger and more cumbersome. Ships like this were not built for speed. When they were in deep space, they were bases for smaller and more nimble craft. The Everbright would take the best part of a year to reach Titan. The ship itself would rarely, if ever, see military action. It was the smaller chasers that went on missions. Hero pilots like Nicky Jones and Silvio Pellegrini were ready to defend the outer settlement against attacks from the mysterious enemy ships coming from interstellar space that were slowing down to pay a visit. Or so the stories went. Jonathan imagined his father in a place like this, walking around in uniform, wearing his usual distant expression. Would his father have had friends on board a ship like this? Lovers? He had never spoken of anyone still in the force. He'd never spoken of his time on the long journeys, and the only thing he would say about the alien enemy was that they were a fabrication of the Corps, just so that they could keep their ever-increasing level of funding for military projects. Jonathan didn't know what to believe anymore. Back on Earth, people had started to question everything. Did the aliens exist? Was there really a pilot named Nicky Jones? All the preparations and information gathering were supposedly happening in the outer solar system, and no one except the Corps knew the truth. No one on Earth had telescopes powerful enough to see what the Corps claimed to be seeing. On the one hand, it seemed too elaborate an operation for the alien enemy to be a hoax. On the other hand, if the alien enemy was approaching as fast as the military telescopes calibrated, by the time they had any corroborating evidence, it would be far too late. The injured soldier sat in bed in the ship's tiny hospital room. He'd been listening to music, his eyes closed. "Hello, Peter," their guide said. The patient half opened his eyes and tried to say something, but the words came out in a mumble. "You got him sedated?" Gaby asked. "He's in a lot of pain." Not being a medical person, Jonathan shuddered. He was less than an assistant. He'd just offered to help wheel the patient into the station's hospital, because this had been his idea and the launch station hospital seemed very busy. Gaby had told him it wasn't necessary, that the trolleys were designed so she could do it alone, but he didn't like that. He didn't want her to get into trouble, because coming here had been his idea. The soldier asked the patient, "Is John around somewhere?" Presumably, John was the ship's doctor. "Got out to get something." Jonathan felt chilled with how rough and slurred the patient's voice sounded. The soldier continued, "Anyway, these are Dr. Larsen and an assistant to move you to the launch station hospital, where they'll take some detailed scans." He frowned again at Jonathan's name tag. "Hey, can I ask you, are you by any chance related to Paul Bartell?" "He's my father." The man's eyes widened. "No kidding." In a "you dare show your face here" tone. Gaby and the nurse each undid clips on the patient's hospital bed and lifted the whole thing onto the trolley. The patient did a fair bit of wincing through the necessary bumping. He never opened his eyes completely. It seemed to Jonathan that there was a lot more wrong with this man than a broken leg, but he was no doctor, so what did he know? The ship's doctor, John, turned up, and he and Gaby talked medical stuff. It all seemed quite amicable, even if he had little idea what they were talking about. Then Gaby and Jonathan wheeled the patient out of the hospital, through the ship's corridors, into the lift, and through the wobbly access tube. Jonathan wasn't sure if he was more of a hindrance than a help. He hadn't quite found his balance yet, and the trolley was awkward. He left Gaby to deal with the patient at the station's diagnostic unit, and returned to the day's batch of impatient and disgruntled pilots. Hopefully, Helping this man would improve the captain's and Dana White's opinions of him. Chapter 7. Over the next 2 days, Jonathan learned how to get the right and somewhat truthful answers on the form, how to annoy Mars runners, because there were cockroaches and much of their trade was illegal anyway, and how to keep his boss happy by not flagging any more military ships for further processing. He even pleased his boss by processing a number of military ships in record time. He discovered where to find the pathology files and knew he should have entered the Everbright's details there. He felt ashamed about that now. It seemed he was making every newbie mistake in the book. At least he got used to the movement of the station enough to stop leaning. His appetite also returned. The Everbright remained in dock, and every time he walked past, he imagined that the 2 guards at the access tube glared at him, even though they were different people every time, and could not possibly know that he was responsible for their being held up. They had powered down the engine. The info screen next to the tube entrance now said 5% readiness, like it did for all the other ships. He admitted to himself that he'd be glad when they finally left the station for a lower orbit, so that they could send the crew to Earth for their long-awaited leave that he was holding up through a silly mistake. On his second night at the station, he had also met a few other quarantine workers in the dining hall and had dinner with them the next night as well. They were a rather odd group of varied people, not ones he would have chosen as friends on Earth, but it beat having dinner alone, because Gaby didn't come to the canteen on either night. Jonathan figured she was probably on duty. David was ex-military, on sick leave from active duty, with an unspecified illness he wouldn't mention. The subject of this illness was the butt of jokes amongst the others, and impatient to return to duty when he passed certain tests that he also wouldn't mention. He spoke in single-word sentences. Manuela was quite young, and seemed to have gotten the job through no other virtue than that her father owned the company that made a lot of the interior outfits for the station and spacefaring vessels. Carrie was, like himself, a jobless ex-student who explained his presence at the station as, "My dad was going to kick me out of the house. Man, I had nowhere else to go, so I thought I'd sign up someplace as far away from my parents as possible." Manuela laughed long and hard, which she did a lot and which was kind of annoying. Carrie gave Jonathan a puzzled, "I didn't think it was that funny" kind of look. Jonathan cringed and looked aside and spotted Gaby sitting alone at a table. She wore her hospital overalls, minus apron and gloves, and stared into her tray. It occurred to him that 2 days ago she had perhaps been looking for someone to talk to when she spotted him sitting alone. He glanced at her every now and then and wondered if he should invite her over, but she was too absorbed in her thoughts to notice him. "Hey, that's Gaby Larsen, not your type, mate," Carrie said. "I wasn't." His ears warmed. David said, "Yes, you were. You've been ogling her since she came in. She's a neat package. You should see her at the gym." "Don't get involved with her," Carrie said. "Even if I was ogling her, why not?" "She's the doctor." "Yes, and?" "She knows everything about you and about everyone else. If you tell her something, you don't know where it's going to end up." "What, seriously? Don't doctors have a code of conduct?" Even during his studies, professors had always stressed the point of confidentiality in medical records, if they would ever find themselves in a position where they might need to access them. "Huh, who's going to police that up here?" Carrie's face was serious. "True." The same person who was also not going to check all those details he fed into the computer with the ship files. People got sick in space all the time. People took illnesses with them, and there was no way all transport could be stopped for the sake of something that looked like the flu. Yet that's what the quarantine authorities' instructions had told him to do. What could you do? According to the 3-point questionnaire, no ship should be allowed into Earth space without a lengthy quarantine process. Gaby wasn't the only one eating alone. There were a few others who seemed absorbed in reading material. One was the housing officer who had allocated Jonathan his room. Another wore a pair of overalls. It wasn't so much that they sat alone, but that the people at the far end of the canteen, closest to the kitchen, actively ignored them. Amongst those people he recognized the louts who had made fun of him on the shuttle ride, those same ones who had, for the past 2 days, occupied the large couch in front of the biggest screen in the rec room. "Jonathan!" He looked up. Manuela had called him. She was getting up from the table. What? You were daydreaming. Do you want to come and play Space Invaders with us?" Sure. Playing games seemed to be all they ever did, but it was pretty decent entertainment if you counted the rivalry between the teams from the military and base personnel. They returned their plates to the kitchen and made their way to the door. When they were in the corridor, away from any curious listeners, Jonathan asked in a low voice, "I have a question about work." She gave him an, "Oh, look." When you are filling in that questionnaire and a ship fails 2 of the questions, what do you do? "Well," Manuela said, "aren't we supposed to go to White's office?" "Have you ever done that?" All 3 shook their heads. "Why not? You've been here how many months? Have you never seen anything that's suspicious? Or material hitched a ride into the ship that could be organic and come from off-Earth? Surely you've met crews who have done on-ground work, the moon or asteroid belt miners, for example." "But they have pre-approved permits," Carrie said. "You just punch in the number. The system takes care of the rest." "Yeah, so do the military," added David. "What about private miners? Plenty of contractors for the asteroid mining consortiums come through here. Don't tell me they always have their stuff in order." There was a small silence. David walked ahead. He walked as if he marched, leaving Jonathan to look at his broad back. He wondered what kind of illness made David unfit for service. He looked pretty healthy. Manuela lowered her voice. "Most of the private miners have standing arrangements with quarantine." "By standing arrangements you mean cheating," Jonathan said. Manuela met his eyes, intense. "What?" Jonathan spread his hands. "Look, I see things this way. Earth wants these checks, but the Orbital Launch Station is too powerless, too spineless, or too involved with the big players to implement them. So they implement fast rules where no one who would fail the questionnaire actually gets to complete it." Carrie said, "Well, I wouldn't put it in that way. I do. I made the unfortunate mistake of taking my job seriously. I somehow managed to miss that the Everbright had a standing arrangement with the quarantine authority to let it pass unquestioned. The captain was even unaware of the necessity of completing it." "You spoke to Captain Farrell?" Manuela's eyes were wide. "I didn't know that was a special thing, but I did." He was starting to get irritated. "Man," David said, "she's a hero, saving us from alien invasion. She wouldn't do anything illegal." Manuela shook her head. "No, never." "Maybe not her directly, but her crew might. They might even do it without her knowledge." The latter sarcastic. David turned around, his face flustered. "Man, what are you actually on about? I want to keep my job. Just do the fucking job and leave the questions. Who cares anyway?" "As I see it, it is our task to make a choice. Is this job of ours about protecting Earth from harmful diseases? Or is it about politics between the quarantine authority and the Space Force? Ultimately, between civilian governments and the Force. That's really what I'm about. Civilian institutes seem to think that there is a risk. The Mars case shows that there may well be. David snorted. So, a handful of colonists on Mars got the shits. Wow, seriously, man. They didn't need to go that far away. I can get the shits right here from the crappy food. On Mars, it's an illness caused by exobacteria. We need to do research to check the bacteria's effects. We don't know if giving people the shits is all it does. If we can stop it spreading, scientists will have longer to work on it before it eventually does spread to Earth. We're playing with valuable time here. The Force wants to continue business as usual. It's afraid that too many ships will be pulled up for carrying illegal material, and that practices will come to light that they would prefer to keep hidden. So, they've got White here, who is so tied down that she can do nothing except agree to their demands. They're laughing about the Mars bacteria. Nothing serious. It's all a big to-do that will blow over. David said, It will. We get these scandals every couple of months. Last time it was about misappropriation of the station's general account. This is nothing like that. This is about stopping harmful organisms reaching Earth. This is not a bureaucratic issue. Man, don't take it so seriously. How else am I supposed to take it? Carrie shrugged, looking uneasy. Whatever, man. God, now Jonathan was angry. If the quarantine authority wanted people to rubber stamp bogus forms, they shouldn't have appointed an exo-biologist to the job. You get to use your knowledge. What a load of rubbish. They didn't want anyone with useful knowledge. They wanted minions who didn't bother anyone. Chapter 8. Jonathan played Space Invaders with Manuela and then watched half of a movie on one of the smaller screens towards the back of the room. The screen was so small that it was difficult to see the movie properly, and the sound was being drowned out by the large screen at the front where that guy Cresswell and his mates were laughing. Eventually he'd had enough and went to his room. It was still too early to go to bed, so he dressed in his sports gear and went to the gym. There were a few people on the treadmills and bikes. One woman in the corner was going flat out. She was whip-thin, her breasts mere mounds on a taut chest and stomach. She wore tight-fitting leggings of a shimmering material that rippled with her muscles. Her short hair was dripping with sweat. Gaby. Jonathan climbed on a bike, in the row in front of her, distinctly aware how pale and hairy his legs were, and how lacking in impressive muscles. He fiddled with the music, but he could still hear the pounding of the machine behind him. Eventually it whined to a stop. Gaby walked past, wiping her face with a towel. Gaby! She stopped and looked at him with a distant expression. Her face was red and shining with sweat. Her chest heaved with breaths. Oh, hi. She wiped her face again. Nice run? Bit short, only 20k. She glanced at a man running on another treadmill at the back of the room. Well, I stink. I'll go in the shower. Yeah, that sounded all kinds of wrong. No, I mean, you don't stink. What did Carrie say was wrong with Gaby? Right now, nothing seemed wrong with her at all. An awkward silence. Jonathan wanted to keep talking to her, even if only to prove that he wasn't as stupid as he sounded. He grasped onto the first subject he could remember. How is the man with a broken leg? He went back to the ship. Could you do anything for him? Carrie stuck his head into the gym. Hey, Jonathan, you want to come for a drink? Gaby gave him an uneasy smile. Manuela and David looked into the room over Carrie's shoulder. Maybe later, Jonathan said to them. Gaby gave him a half smile. Look, I won't keep you from your friends. They're not my friends, they're just colleagues. Is there a problem with this injured man or anything? Or is there a problem with my friends? She glanced sideways. Do you want to see it? His leg? The X-ray. Yes, sure. It was kind of strange, and he had no idea why she thought he could make a comment about X-rays, but what the heck. He got off the bike and followed her out of the room, breathing a waft of wet and sweaty clothes in her wake. They were well into the corridor when she said in a low voice, "You know, there is no such thing as just colleagues up here. After you've been here for a while, people become either friends or enemies. There is no in-between. Trust me." The look in her eyes chilled him. He followed her through the corridors to the hospital. She didn't speak, and he didn't ask any further questions. In fact, the whole thing was decidedly awkward, and he had no idea where to look. Jonathan had been to the hospital briefly for a medical checkup when coming off the shuttle, and when helping Gaby with a man with a broken leg, but had not seen more than a simple waiting room and a nurse's station. The small emergency room was behind the waiting room. It held 6 beds, 4 of which were occupied. He remembered his briefing by the quarantine authority before leaving Earth. A cheerful woman in a business suit had assured him that they had a fully equipped hospital that could deal with most emergencies. But although the room seemed well equipped, he had the feeling that if he were to get sick, he'd rather not do it while working at the launch station. He suspected that the hospital's main task was to bundle the patient off to a flight down to Earth as quickly as they could. A number of doors opened into the emergency room, and one of them bore a tag that said Dr. G. Larsen. Light flickered on automatically when Gaby opened the door. The room looked like a field version of a typical doctor's practice, with a small desk, a chair for the patient, and an examination bed. The wall shelves sported clear plastic boxes containing a variety of bandages, rolls of sticking plaster, and balls of cotton wool, tubes, needles, scalpels, tweezers, and other more sinister implements. Gaby shut the door and went to the desk. Jonathan sat in the patient chair. "I'm going to show you this because there is something you need to be aware of before you really put your foot in it. You're young and new, and have the best intentions to do the best job possible, but up here it's very easy to do too good a job." She activated her pad and set it up on a stand. The entire back wall of the room lit up with an X-ray image showing a bone, or rather, lots of fragments of bone. "Is that the leg? Looks pretty bad." Gaby snorted. "Pretty bad? A strong man with a hammer couldn't do this much damage, let alone a fall, no matter how severe. And he didn't fall that badly." Jonathan frowned and studied the photo. "Then what? I'm sorry, I'm not a doctor. I don't know what a normal break looks like." "Nothing like this." "Then what do you think happened? What did he say about it?" "He kept telling me that he fell, but it's pretty clear that something else happened aboard that ship. Didn't you notice how nervous they all were?" He hadn't noticed that much, except that the patient had looked too sick to just have a broken leg. And that nurse who had asked about his father, maybe he'd been too annoyed about that to notice anything else. So, what do you think? She hesitated and licked her lips. "Okay, I'm going to tell you something now that I don't want you to repeat elsewhere to anyone, all right?" He frowned. "You need to know this before you put your foot in anything else." "I didn't put my foot." "You didn't cause some trouble with that ship?" That had all been dealt with, hadn't it? Why the hell did people keep talking about it? Gaby took another deep breath. "Have you ever heard about shame parties?" The term sounded familiar. "I have, vaguely. Wait, wasn't that why those officers were arrested a few months back?" He remembered something about it on the news. "I don't know. I probably wouldn't have heard. Our news is very limited up here." He had noticed. "You really only get Earth news, don't you?" "The Space Corps news is mostly filtered. They give us approved news, which is mostly general Earth news about things that the Corps has no involvement with. When it comes to news about the Corps, they don't give us the same story they tell the public either. The philosophy goes that we're supposed to get this news from our supervisors in a more complete form. And I'm guessing that the operative word in that sentence is supposed?" She nodded and sighed. "In any case, Shame parties are the awful abominations that happen amongst isolated crew, commonly on deep space flights. A group decides that certain crew members have acted against the group and need to be shamed. This usually happens in a rec room or some such, and can involve anything from the victim having to wear silly clothing or to go naked for a day, to cases of horrific abuse. Jonathan felt cold. You mean they're bullied? That and worse. It's a black mark on the reputation of the Space Corps, and they won't discuss it. I see a fair number of cases. None of the victims will talk about it or make a statement. Hang on. If this was going on within her crew, then why would Captain Farrell let us on board and let you take those pictures? Because she doesn't know. This is also why the rest of the crew were not happy to have us there. Damn. What have you done about it? She looked at him, eyebrows raised. Have you reported it or anything? Where should I report it? To, I don't know, authorities? Police? Do you see any police? Space Force militia, then. She laughed, not in a happy way, like they'd act against their own people, especially the ship crew. Haven't you noticed how much everyone here adores ship crew? Strangely enough, his colleagues had told him the same thing today. But you could report it to the captain. Like she would believe my word over that of her crew. But then, is anyone doing anything about this? She went on, her voice low. We, you and I, in our capacities as quarantine officer and doctor, may be the only people who have access to those ships and their crews. But then, if there are problems aboard those ships, we may be the only outsiders to notice. Yup, welcome to the Orbital Launch Station, where secrets come to die. He stared at her. Was she really saying that everyone kept quiet about this? But we have to do something. You know the saying that the best way to avoid shame parties is not to get involved in them. Basically, we can shut up and keep our jobs. As for the victim, the Space Corps will pay for his medical expenses and accept him back. If he makes a fuss and asks for a court hearing, he's as good as gone. He won't get any medical expenses paid. That's the way of the Space Corps. He stared at her, a feeling of horror creeping over him. But that's awful. I know. It's the way it is. Chapter 9. That night, and all through the next day, Jonathan thought of all the questions he should have asked her, but hadn't. Could she let someone know about abuse amongst ship crew anonymously? How often did it happen? Did it happen at the launch station too? All the next day, he eyed the various crews of the ships walking the passages of the station and wondered what they got up to in the times that the station's public places went quiet. And he looked at the people walking alone and tried to gauge whether they had ever been victims. In the rec room that night, he met up with Carrie and Manuela. David was there too, but he sat at one of the wall screens racing a Space Corps guy in a game where the players had little spaceships. A couple of the guy's mates stood at his back. One was tall and muscular. His name tag said Cooper. The other had a shaven head with tattoos, and his tag said Horvax. Both stared intently at the screen over their colleague's shoulder. Their faces were blue with the glow of the screen. "Get him!" Cooper yelled. "Yeah, get the fucker!" His face scrunched up in deep concentration. David managed to outmaneuver the other guy. He laughed. "Ha! I win! So much for active duty, huh?" Cooper turned to him. "What were you? Steadfast, right?" This was a large Space Corps supply ship. David straightened his back. His eyes were penetrating. "I served on Steadfast, Endurance, and Resilience." All three supply ships, although the latter was a long-distance ship. Horvax snorted and clapped his mate on the back. "Come on, show the fucker what we think of the cowards in logistics." Jonathan sat down on one of the couches against the back wall, feeling uneasy. now that Gaby had brought the bullying to his attention. Subtle and slightly less subtle hints of unpleasantness were everywhere. He noticed how the groups were divided along lines of military and non-military, or older military and new recruits, or higher-ranked military and lower-ranked troops, ship crew versus station crew. The ones who had the best positions in front of the big screen were veteran members of station military staff. The group included Cresswell, who had made fun of Jonathan on the flight. The movie was some sort of B-grade horror flick. A zombie shambled through a dark alley after a young woman to whom it had obviously not occurred to take off her high-heeled shoes and run. The crew, men all, cheered every time the zombie came closer. Manuela dropped into the spot next to him, rolling her eyes. "Pfft, stupid movies." Jonathan nodded. Then she met his eyes. "I meant to ask you earlier, but are you at all related to Paul Bartell?" "Why is everyone asking? Okay, he's my father. What has that got to do with anything?" Jonathan had spoken much louder than he intended. A silence fell in the room as everyone looked at him with strange expressions. "Well," she shrugged. Her cheeks had gone bright red. "Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned it. I didn't mean to upset you." "Manuela, I'm not upset. I don't know what my father did. I am not my father. My parents divorced when I was young. Even before that, my father was never there. I suppose it was part of the reason why they got divorced. He was kind of a dick, still is sometimes. My mother kept me away from him and never told me anything about his job and always discouraged me from going into space. The dismissal happened after he left us. I don't know anything about it. I don't know what happened and why he left. I've only started talking to him again recently, now that I don't live with my mother anymore. And it's not the sort of thing you talk about with a son you haven't spoken to for 20 years, is it? Hey, Dad, I heard you got dismissed from the Space Corps. Could you tell me all about it? That would go down well. Oh. She let her shoulders slump. I feel such a goose now. No need. Yes, he's my father. No, he's never taught me anything other than try not to be like him. But maybe you could tell me why everyone gets so hung up about it." Colour had risen to her cheeks. "I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't think I'm the right person to tell you. I only heard bits of it through gossip. I don't even know which parts are true." She would not tell him any more, and Jonathan went to his room with anger brewing inside him. He wanted to speak to his father, but he had a feeling that if his father had not told him anything about the circumstances relating to his dismissal by now, he never would. It was not as if Jonathan had never tried to talk about his father's time in space either. In his cabin, he spent some time unpacking the remains of his bag. Up until now, he'd just dug out what he needed, but he put all his clothes away, dumped his personal things on the desk, his pad, his photo frames, his mementos from home, and stashed his bag on top of the shelf of the tiny cupboard. Then he dusted off the screen of his pad. Seriously, why did those things always attract so much dust? And hung the photo frame on the wall with a magnetic hanger. Just as he stepped back to look at the result, the frame cycled through a very old photo. His parents on their wedding day. Dressed in his Space Corps uniform, his father looked very sexy. His mother's friends would have been jealous, but Jonathan recognized the stiff set of his father's jaw. Underneath the glamour, he was the same man Jonathan knew today, bitter, angry, unhappy. "What did you do that makes everyone hate you so?" he asked his father in the photo. The frame answered his question by changing to the next picture, of himself as a young boy with his mother and aunt, taken on a trip to the beach. Also in the picture was Molly, the beagle. Poor Molly, she'd been dead a number of years. Jonathan took his pad and sat back on his bed, leaning against the wall. He turned it on, bringing up the search database on the screen. It brought up nothing under Paul Bartell other than very general, useless information. That he was a nuclear scientist with the Corps, a list of ships that he had served on, and a mention of his last service period at the Orbital Launch Station, when he'd retired, but not why. There wasn't even more than some very general information about the type of project he'd worked on. Jonathan stared into nothingness. What if his father had seen something he shouldn't have and wanted to report it? He turned on his computer. He had not used any of his off-station bandwidth allowance. He was going to send a message. No, these channels were not private. He couldn't ask his father any direct questions. But he could make suggestions. He typed, "Requested contact, Paul Bartell." He entered the number. The send icon came up on the screen. It was a depiction of a radio wave snaking over the screen. When it fell off one end, another came from the opposite side. After a while it said, "Not available. Leave a message." Damn, he hadn't checked the time of day. His father might be asleep. He started typing, "I have arrived at the Orbital Launch Station. All is well with me. Do you have any contacts who can talk to me about your work here? Please message me back when..." The screen lit up. A message scrolled across it. "Don't be stupid." Ah, so his father had been watching. "I have to know." And then he added, "It's safer for me to know what happened, in case I make the same mistakes." After that, his father remained quiet for some time. Jonathan wondered if this meant that the connection had been broken, but the icon still snaked over the screen. Then the reply came, "Report 8745-23. Use for access code the name of a companion we both held dear who is not with us anymore." Jonathan noted the number before it scrolled off the screen. Name of a companion? What, grandma or other family? But his father had never liked his parents-in-law. Jonathan had never known his grandparents on his father's side. Then he knew. Molly. He went to the station reporting area, typed in the report number, entered the code. After a few tense seconds, a document came on the screen that said, "Physical abuse among space crew. Reports from eyewitnesses." Chapter 10. "Are you kidding?" Gaby looked at Jonathan with wide eyes. "You want to do what?" "I didn't say I wanted to do it, only that I could do it if the situation warranted. If you're willing to back this up." Jonathan was still panting from having run from his cabin to the hospital. He'd come here early so that he could talk to her before they both started work. "You're crazy." "No, I'm serious. The report said that in most cases of serious abuse, the abusers lost their sense of judgment because they'd been using chrysalia. Your medical detail should be able to confirm whether or not the victim used chrysalia. If they used it, there have to be live cultures on board, because there is no other way to produce the gas, and the bacteria are really short-lived. It's a bacterium. It's from Titan. If the crew of the Everbright have it, that will fail White's quarantine test in half a second flat. I can flag it and order an investigation as quarantine officer." Gaby said nothing, but stared at some document she'd had on her screen when he came in. "So the question is, did the victim use chrysalia?" "Sorry, I can't tell you." "Gaby, please." "A doctor's report is confidential." "I know that. But you also have a duty to report any criminal behavior. I'm asking you to help me, please. You saw what was done to that man. It's too awful for words." No matter how it had happened, to have your leg broken as badly as that had to hurt an awful lot. He imagined the face and screams of the crew member while his mates put his leg into a vice. He could hear the bones snap and the victim scream, vomit and pass out. God, he shuddered. Gaby shook her head. "Do you have a death wish? In case you haven't noticed it, people in the Force adore Captain Farrell. You would accuse her and her ship of smuggling drugs as well as abusing crew members? No, of having live exobacteria on board, which the quarantine law specifically prohibits. I'm not going to mention the abuse. Small comfort. She spread her hands. Do you realize what you're doing to yourself? How it's going to wreck your career forever? Jonathan had to make an effort not to shout. And you think your career is more important than closing an eye to this behavior? The soft voices of some medical personnel drifted through the door from the emergency room. Jonathan remembered how sexy she had looked at the gym. He said, "It's your choice. If that man has been abused, I want to do something about it. I can keep the ship here." "No, Jonathan, it's a stupid idea and you know it." "It would start an investigation and the truth will come out." "No, take it from me. You can't do that." "Yes, I can. There might not be any records of chrysalia having been harmful to humans, but there has been no research. I can make a case that in the light of what happened at Mars, we need to order an investigation. Since Mars, Earth has become nervous about these organisms. If we flag the ship as contaminated, that will send all kinds of experts up here, and the Everbright is going to be stuck here for a long time, and the authorities will swarm all over the ship. The abuse is bound to come out, because if this man is injured this badly, there will be others, right?" Gaby didn't reply. Jonathan couldn't decide if her expression was one of horror or amazement. He continued in a lower voice, "You know, last night I found out what happened to my father. He was a crew member on the Everbright. He witnessed one of these shame parties, and one victim was a friend of his. This friend was too scared to report the incident, so my father reported it. Damn it, he had never felt more proud of his father than he had since last night. All his life his mother had told him how useless his father was, and that was a plain lie. He was stubborn enough to carry it through and report it to Earth authorities. He lost his position because his colleagues were too afraid. They didn't stand with him, even though they knew what happened. I don't want to repeat that. Let's make a stand. Let's end this." "No, you can't do it. Seriously, please don't." Her voice was anguished and trembled. He met her eyes. "What, Gaby? What do you think has been going on in this hospital all the time? Didn't you see Cresswell and his mates on the flight? They're mates with all the bullies on the ships. I'm the doctor, right? I'm the one who gets to see all these injuries." Her expression said, "And they will kill me if I report them." Her eyes glittered. "I can't help you, Jonathan. I really can't. My sister is in the Space Corps as well. No matter how careful and confidential you are, people will know." "Shit. What have they done to you, Gaby?" She shook her head. "I can't tell you any more. I've already said too much. I should never have shown you that photo or told you about this. Never. Now, get out. Gaby, get out. Out!" Jonathan scrambled from his chair, backed into the door, and managed to open it behind his back. In the emergency room, a nurse laughed at him. "She has quite the temper, eh?" Chapter 11. Jonathan felt nervous all day. In the docking area, he had a constant feeling that someone was watching him. He approved a few ships for departure, but didn't feel happy about approving any of them. The procedure was a farce, merely ticking boxes to keep people on Earth under the illusion that they controlled what came back from space. The monsters were not small bacteria. The threat came from within humanity. At dinner, Carrie, Manuela, and David were quiet. David hinted that they had copped some remarks and jokes in ill taste about the quarantine authority. He glanced at Jonathan from the corner of his eyes when he said this. Clearly, it was Jonathan's fault. He returned to the crew quarters after dinner. At the door to the rec room, he spotted Manuela, Carrie, and David at their usual computer. Cresswell and the others watched the large screen close to the door. Jonathan went inside, but Manuela, Carrie, and David were too absorbed in their game to take any notice of him. Their opponents in the game, a couple of Space Corps troops, glared at him, and Cresswell was staring at him too, daring him to stay or sit anywhere he wasn't allowed. Jonathan left again. In his own room, he tried writing to his mother, but his mind kept churning. Later, he tossed and turned in his bed. After he had lain there for a long time, staring at the blinking light of the fire alarm on the ceiling, he decided sleep wasn't going to happen. He got up, checked the corridor. It was empty, and went to the rec room to make himself some hot chocolate. Without anyone sitting on the couches and chairs, the room looked kind of dead, as well as twice its regular size. He sat on the couch facing the biggest screen, the one normally reserved for Cresswell and his mates, and fiddled with the in-house entertainment while sipping his chocolate. Wow, those soldier boys watched a lot of violent vids. He flicked through the channels. The choice was pathetic. Wrestling, racing, sanitized Earth news, more sanitized Earth news, some medieval fight show, some sort of dance exercise program for women. Sheesh, that woman was skinny. A door hissed aside down the corridor, and there was the sound of footsteps. A moment later, a couple of men entered the rec room. There were 4 of them, beefy guys in military overalls, and they took up positions blocking the door, hands in pockets. 2 of them had the shaven head so common with military in space. Jonathan had never seen them before. They said nothing, just watched, a silent wall of muscle. Jonathan didn't know where to look. The vid still blared with a skinny woman twisting her body and wriggling her hips. One of the men, with a name tag, Ormsby, spoke. "You're the Bartell kid?" "What if I am?" He didn't like the man's tone. He was not a kid. He rose, leaving the vid on the stupid show. "I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Stan will do." He eyed Jonathan up and down. "So it's you making all this trouble?" "Trouble?" "You know what I'm talking about. Don't give me any bullshit. He sent you and he's still trying to get back at us." What the heck was this about? If you're talking about my father, you're wrong. No one is trying to get back at anyone. My father has no interest in the ship anymore, and I've done nothing wrong. Jonathan did his best to keep his back straight and look the thug in the eye. The man laughed. "Is that so? You done nothing wrong, huh?" Jonathan didn't reply. "Well, I damn well hope so. One of the rules of this place is that you keep your nose out of other people's business if you want to keep it in the middle of your face. No need to threaten me. You're going to be cocky, huh? You know how much I like midgets who are cocky? I want you to back off, approve all ships for departure." He came forward into the room. Jonathan stepped back. "I'm doing my job. I'm a quarantine officer. I have my job description, and I will stick to that. Do you know anything about the way this place is run? I got my instructions." Jonathan had retreated so far that he could feel the warmth of the screen at his back. Colours from the stupid exercise vid flashed over Ormsby's overalls. "That right, huh? Instructions, huh? Please let me through so I can get back to my cabin." The men laughed at this. One at the back said, "Did you hear that?" He put on a squeaky voice. "Please let me get through so I can get back to my cabin." Ormsby waved his mates aside. "Move aside so that the prince can leave." Jonathan detached himself from the vid, turned it off in all silence, and walked towards the door, until one of the men grabbed his jacket. "Not so fast." The thug, Stan, drew Jonathan up. From close up, his lips were cracked from the dry air. He had a tattoo of a spaceship on his neck. His eyes were grey, and there was a brown spot in his left eye. "Let me go." The men laughed. Jonathan pulled harder. "Let me go. I'm not doing anything to you." Another man grabbed both his arms and held him behind his back. "Look at the little shrimp. I don't think he got his lesson. Maybe we should teach him." Jonathan managed to get his left arm out of the sleeve of his jacket. Guess there were advantages to being skinny and used to having to escape bullies. He clamped his hand over Stan's forearm and shoved his assailant back into the wall as hard as he could, which, admittedly, with Stan's bulk being twice Jonathan's, wasn't very hard. Stan stumbled. He yelled. Something hard connected with the side of Jonathan's head. He saw black, went down on his knees, hard. A drop of blood fell onto the floor in front of him. Damn. The sounds in the room came to him as through a thick sheet of glass. Yelling and screaming, people running. Jonathan wiped his face. The back of his hand came away covered in blood. He probed his face with his fingers. One of his teeth had cut through his lip. Chapter 12. Through the pain and pounding of his head, Jonathan registered that the yelling didn't stop, and to be honest, it didn't sound like a victory yell. There was something chilling about it. Jonathan rose, despite the ringing in his ears and the fact that blood was dripping from his face. Two of the men were holding Stan, who was rolling on the floor, his forearm with a sickening bend, as if it had been caught in a door. Jonathan muttered, "Oh, God." He felt sick. He found his voice. "Don't touch him." Everyone looked at him, and because they were already touching him, he added, "Keep him still." And then they gave him a "what the fuck do you think we're doing" look. I'll call a doctor." He was trembling, feeling sweaty. He couldn't keep his eyes from that strangely bent arm. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the address book. His hands trembled. Blood trickled down his chin. Gaby Larsen. Ah, there she was. He selected the number. It rang a few times before she answered. "Who's there?" "I'm sorry to disturb you, but—" Stan screamed. "What's going on?" Her voice sounded alarmed. "Someone just hurt himself in the rec room." God, he had caused all this? He'd only shoved the thug into the wall. It wasn't even a very hard shove. "I don't understand, I barely touched him." Another scream. Some of Stan's mates yelled at him to shut up. "Hold on, I'm coming." She hung up. He wondered if she was still angry with him. Jonathan went in search of a towel or something to wipe his face. The rec room had a little wet cupboard, but there was only a drying cubicle and no towels. He couldn't find the first aid kit or any sign pointing to it. The blood was starting to run into the neck of his shirt, so he wiped it with the back of his hand. He made a mess of his sleeves. Where was the damn first aid kit? A few people whose rooms were close to the rec room came out to see what the racket was about. Everyone was trying to help Stan. Everyone was yelling, and this caused more people to come out of their cabins. "What's going on?" a woman asked. Someone else said, "Some ship crew got into a fight." "Hey, he's wearing Ormsby's overalls." Someone gave Jonathan a towel. Gaby came running into the rec room not much later. With her was a nurse pushing a wheelchair. She sank onto her knees next to Stan, whipped an injector gun out of her bag, clicked in an ampoule, and then another one, and gave him 2 shots, one in each arm. The screaming stopped soon after. A couple of the men lifted Stan into the wheelchair, his head lolling to the side, and the nurse wheeled him off. Gaby gathered her things and while she rose, met Jonathan's eyes. Her hair was messy from sleep. "Was that you calling me?" He nodded, wiping his chin. The towel was white and had acquired an impressive red stain. "What did you do to your face?" Jonathan looked sideways, where the 3 remaining thugs were listening to the conversation. He felt dizzy. Can I talk about that later?" "Come to the hospital to get that fixed up." She took him by the arm and led him down the corridor, catching up with the wheelchair. "Didn't I warn you not to go down that road?" Gaby said in a low voice. "I didn't go down any road. I only asked you about reporting the man with a broken leg as abuse victim. I never did anything about it." She glared at him. "All right, you don't believe me. It's true. You are the only person I mentioned it to. Funny how they found out, isn't it?" "What's that supposed to mean?" "Whatever you wanted to. Feel guilty if that suits you." She pushed him aside, pinning him into the wall. He called out, "Hey!" Her face was less than a hand's width from his. She spoke slowly, articulating each word for extra effect. "Don't you dare suggest anything like that ever again." Jonathan snorted. "Then tell me how they found out." "You've left a trail of stupidity all over this station since you started. No one needs to have heard what you said to me to have enough reason to bash your face in. So, I'm stupid, huh? It's stupid to do my job properly, to flag situations that can be dangerous, to report bribery, to help people who are powerless against bullies. I can be either stupid or a coward. Guess what it's going to be. She met his eyes for a few long moments, then let him go and continued walking. All the rest of the way to the hospital, neither of them spoke. Into the hospital room, where it smelled strongly of antiseptics, a couple of nurses had put Stan on a bed in the middle, his eyes half open. One of his mates sat on the bed next to him, glaring at Jonathan. "Wait here," Gaby ordered him, her voice cold and professional. She went to the cupboard at the side, took out a bag and gave it to him. "Hold that to your face, unless you want to look like a gerbil tomorrow." The bag felt like it was filled with gel. It was cold. Jonathan sat on one of the chairs near the door. He pressed the ice pack to his lip. The outside of it was made out of cloth and blood smeared onto it. He hoped that was okay. Some nurses wheeled Stan away, into the imaging room, he presumed. The mate stayed behind, studiously avoiding Jonathan. His overalls said Ferguson. Jonathan guessed those weren't his overalls either. Jonathan wondered what was going to happen now. Would he be charged with anything? There were a few other patients in the small ward, but all were unconscious or asleep. The first, probably, because he couldn't imagine sleeping through the racket that everyone had made. One of the patients was attached to a machine that issued small beeps. The other had a mask over his face. He grew sick of watching their unmoving forms. There were no screens, nothing to read or do. And he couldn't look at half the room because the thugs sat there. Jonathan's mind kept going over the incident. He hadn't pushed Stan that hard, had he? How could an arm just break like that? He had no idea how long he'd been sitting there when Gaby came back. She spoke briefly to the mate, and the man left, flipping Jonathan the bird while going out the door. Gaby said, "Now let's have a look at you." Maybe she hadn't seen the mate's gesture or ignored it. Her expression was hard. She took him into a practice room of the main ward. Again he sat on the patient chair while she produced a box from a shelf and pulled the lid off. She rummaged inside. Jonathan noticed an electronic photo frame on her desk which displayed a picture of herself with a middle-aged white-haired man and a dark-skinned woman with a plait of glossy black hair that hung well past her shoulders. There was a pad on the desk, showing an image that looked suspiciously like an X-ray. The guy's arm, he guessed. Gaby had taken out band-aids, a bag of balls of cotton wool, and a bottle. She came to sit next to him with a tray that contained all those things. Now, what actually happened? Jonathan recounted the story through a swollen lip and a tongue that was starting to go stiff, while she sprinkled fluid on cotton wool and dabbed his face. Couldn't sleep. Went to the rec room. Some thugs came in, said they didn't like my father, and when I wanted to leave, one of them knocked me flat. I pushed him against the wall, not very hard. She was cleaning his lip, face screwed up in concentration. He asked, "What did you think of that break?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss other people's medical details." "But you did before. Come on, Gaby, I need your help. What do you think? Because I didn't shove him that hard. You know, me being the size I am, I'm not exactly your ultimate gym hunk." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "I haven't seen the photos yet. My colleague is looking after him." Bullshit, and she knew it. The photo was right there on her desk. All she needed to do was pick it up. She wasn't meeting his eyes, yet Jonathan didn't understand what she was hiding. After all, he had pushed the man. There was no abuse in this case. The pile of red-stained, soggy balls of cotton wool grew while she worked on his face. She was very close, her big and dark eyes concentrated on his mouth. Her hair was slightly longer in the neck, where soft curls lay against her skin, which was olive brown. That dark woman had to be her mother. Ouch! He took in a sharp breath. Sorry, it bleeds a lot, but I think I can fix it up with a bit of glue and a piece of tape. You won't look very pretty for the next few days. That won't make much of a difference then. One corner of her mouth lifted. He liked seeing the smile on her face. Did it mean she forgave him for challenging her? Sorry, I didn't mean to call you a coward. I get called all sorts of things in here. You get used to it. She put some sort of glue on his lip. The stuff smelled funny and left a lump on his skin. He raised his hand. No, don't touch it. It needs to dry. It will fall off by itself after a few days. Great, walking around with a lump on his lip. When the glue was dry, she proclaimed him ready. You can stay here in the ward if you want. That's not necessary. He'd rather not stay with this other guy. Will you be fine to walk by yourself? I'm not going to faint or anything. But that probably wasn't why she had asked. His cabin was in the other sector. He thought of the long corridor that ran past the storage and recycling area that he needed to traverse, all the places where someone could wait for him and finish off what they started. They would know where he was. Someone could knock him unconscious and stick him in one of the maintenance tunnels. He shuddered. But he pretended to be calm. He reached his room without trouble. Chapter 13. But whatever a simple trip to the rec room to get hot chocolate had done, it hadn't cured his insomnia. As soon as he lay down, Jonathan felt alert again. He dragged his computer to his bed and lay propped up on one elbow. Looking up the launch station's crew was easy enough. Stan Ormsby was indeed an electrician, 53, 1.93 meters tall. The database showed him with a short pepper and salt beard that stood out clearly on his black skin. Yeah, even if he'd since shaved off the beard, there was no way that Stan was who he claimed to be. Since the real Stan Ormsby had worked at the station for more than 10 years, Jonathan found it very hard to believe that Gaby wouldn't know who he was. She'd lied to him about Stan, about the X-rays. Was she that afraid? At that very moment, his electronic photo frame chose to show a picture he'd added to his collection at the very last moment before leaving. His father in uniform, at some sort of ceremony, collecting an award. He thought of the paper he'd read detailing the many cases of abuse, including the horrific case that had concluded with his father's dismissal for whistleblowing. He did not want to follow in his father's path. If these things still happened aboard the Everbright, he was in a position to stop them. All he needed was the hospital records and proof of chrysalia use on board, because then he could stop the ship on quarantine grounds. Halfway down the passage was an alcove with hazard suits. If he put on one of those helmets, he could enter the hospital without being recognized. During the night shift, there would not be many people. He could sneak into Gaby's room and have a look at the records. For the second time that night, he changed out of his pajamas. He armed himself with his pad to copy the evidence and considered taking a real weapon, but a quick search of his cabin didn't yield anything that looked like a stick, and he figured that if anyone came close enough for him to use a stick, he was pretty much lost anyway. He did, however, tuck the pad in his jacket so that he'd have both hands free. Then he opened the door. The corridor had returned to its semi-dark slumber. It was empty, and his footsteps sounded loud. He tried to walk quietly, but that didn't make much of a difference. He hurried around a corner and almost crashed into someone who came running from the other direction. He swerved and tripped, narrowly missing bashing his head into the wall. He went down on his knees. Ouch. He patted his busted lip gingerly. Thankfully, there was no blood. Jonathan! The hand that was stretched out to him was Gaby's. She heaved him up, still out of breath from running. I apologize. You were right. I was just coming to talk to you. I was going to talk to you. Gaby was still out of breath. Jonathan, you have to see this. They ran through the corridors back to the hospital. In Gaby's room, she switched on the screen at the back of the room and an X-ray image flicked onto it. An arm and the bottom half of a hand was visible. 2 bones in the lower arm were completely shattered. "That's just like that guy's leg," he said. She nodded and brought up the leg X-ray alongside. "Only with this one we have more detail. I took a second scan at a higher resolution." She moved her fingers. The image of the leg vanished and the one of the arm enlarged. The shards of bone grew bigger and bigger until they filled the screen. This close up, the break lines weren't straight but kind of jagged, with little semicircular crevices. Those semicircular holes matched up with semicircular holes on the opposite fragment. When Jonathan was little, an old lady used to live next door. She was happy for the kids to play in her garden, which was overgrown with bushes. There was a dead tree in the yard, and one day there was a big storm which blew the tree over. The inside of the trunk and branches was tunneled through with little holes. "Termites," his mother said. That was what the bone looked like. "What do you think?" "I think we're going to need a sample of that." "Well, guess what? You have a sample." She nodded. "It's all yours. Exo-biology is your field of work, isn't it?" "Yeah. I presume you have a microscope here." She nodded. "Can I help?" "Wow," Gaby whispered when Jonathan put the image from the microscope on the big screen. It was dark in the room and his eyes felt scratchy from the lack of sleep. His head pounded and his face hurt. Part of his lip felt like he'd lost sensation in it, and as if it was twice its usual size. But there it was, on the screen, a fragment of bone with a tiny critter. The organism consisted of a few simple cells and looked like a sausage with an enormous mouth. "What would you call that thing?" Gaby asked. "It's a calciphage," Jonathan said. "I've only heard people talk about these. They were mentioned in the paper I had to read for a subject in my degree. Apparently they're common on some of the asteroids, but mostly they're dormant. Maybe they're quite common throughout the solar system. I'm guessing that this particular type finds our bones a rich source." God, no wonder I'd never seen breaks this bad. The bones are just reduced to pulp. That's why we're seeing all these small holes. They're space termites, hollowing out our bones. She shuddered. "I hate termites or ants." And then she looked at him with wide eyes. "The Everbright." "Yes, there will be more cases on board." "They'll all be infected. Heck, we could be infected." "No, that's not what I mean. I saw the ship's name on the departure log." "You're serious? Who cleared them?" Jonathan scrambled from the microscope to a computer. He pulled up the departure screen. There was the Everbright, almost at the top. Shit, how did this happen? They weren't supposed to leave until all the bureaucracy was cleared. Who cleared them? But he knew the likely answer. Dana White, bending over backwards to Captain Farrell. He stared at Gaby, her eyes wide. "How do we stop them?" "I don't know, but we have to." She scooped up her computer and rose from her chair. Jonathan followed her into the emergency room. Someone said, "Gaby!" But she didn't stop. The nurse called, "What's going on?" Jonathan yelled, "Raise a general alarm!" Out into the corridor, through the main passage that led through the docking area. It was still early, and the passage was quiet. Once, Gaby almost crashed into someone coming out of a door. Over there was the Everbright's exhaust tube at the very end. Jonathan yelled, "Stop! Stop!" He almost crashed into Gaby, who had skidded to a halt. The screen showed that the tube had been closed and the umbilicals already retracted. "It seems you missed your flight," said a dock crew member. Chapter 14. Jonathan ran to Dana White's office, where the usual queue of pilots and ship crew already sat on the hard bench against the wall, waiting for her office to open officially. He bypassed all of them and burst into the door. White was with a client, a scruffy, bearded man who looked like one of the Russians who ran private transport to Mars. "Bartell, what's this?" Her eyes widened. "What the hell did you do to your face?" "You cleared the Everbright for departure?" "There was no reason to keep her here." Yes, there was. There were investigations. Paperwork only. Please, Bartell, I'm busy. Can you get to some kind of point? You must stop that ship. Can't. They've gone. Listen, they carry a bone-eating organism to Earth. What the hell are you talking about? Get out of my office, Bartell. Stop the Everbright. I can't. She's gone, thank goodness. Then get someone who can stop the ship. Bartell, I'm warning you. Someone came into the office. Any trouble here? Damn it. Cresswell. Yes, take these two out of here. They're bothering me. Cresswell came in, followed by one of his mates. They dragged Jonathan and Gaby into the main passage. Jonathan yelled, "Why won't anyone listen to us? That ship needs to be stopped." The time for listening to you, Bartell, has long passed. The rot started with your daddy's suggestion that the ship crew routinely abuse their mates and culminated in your stupid handling of the Everbright's application. I've never heard anything so ridiculous. What other bullshit have you made up in order to divert attention away from your bungling? It's not bullshit. Look at the photos. Gaby, show them. But there was no point. The two men dragged the two of them through the corridor. A couple of people came the other way. One of them was Manuela. She said nothing, but met his eyes in a shocked expression. Jonathan mouthed, "Help." He wasn't sure if she understood, or, if she did, whether she would do anything. Being small and female, and having lived here longer than he, she might also be afraid of Cresswell. Cresswell and his mate took Jonathan and Gaby to a disused office and shoved them inside. "You can cool off here." Jonathan ran back to the door. "We demand to see your supervisor. That ship carries a dreadful disease." Cresswell closed the door in his face and locked it. "Hey, you can't leave us in here." He banged on the door. "Let us out! Anyone, can you hear me? Let us out!" "Jonathan," Gaby called him from behind. Jonathan whirled around. "We have to—" "What are you smiling at?" She held up her computer. Cresswell's superior was someone named Major Pascoe. Jonathan didn't know him, but Gaby said that he was the officer in charge of the small military police unit at the station. Gaby herself fell under the Corps' Special Services, which were under Lieutenant Commander Serrano. Neither of those people replied to Gaby's messages. From inside the office, they could hear people outside, but no one came to open the door, no matter how much they knocked. Gaby's face looked haunted. She started pacing around the room. Jonathan was still trying to contact someone who would help them. He sent messages to Manuela and David and Carrie and anyone he thought might help. Meanwhile, the section log showed the Everbright getting closer and closer to Earth. He got desperate and mailed the X-ray and the photo of the critter to every account that had a large enough inbox to receive it. "Stop pacing," he yelled at Gaby. She did, giving him a haunted look. "Your pacing drives me nuts. Relax." "That's easy for you to say, with your rich father in a privileged position." "What are you talking about? My father is retired. Disgracefully, too." "I had hopes for a career in space." "So did I. Does this mean we can't still have one?" If space agencies punished people for revealing truths they didn't want to hear, then he wasn't sure he wanted to work here. Gaby said, "If you've fallen out of favor with these people, you've pretty much had it. The Orbital Launch Station is the gateway to space. If you don't get on with the people here, you can forget about it." "This is not about getting on with the people here. It's about the safety of the entire fucking Earth." She retreated from him. He backed away. "I'm sorry." He wiped his face. Ouch, his lip. "We need to get out of here." She nodded. He studied the door, tried to find something to prise it open, but the room held only 3 chairs and a table, all of them bolted to the floor. There were no cupboards or drawers. His pockets held nothing useful, and a pull tab from the zip of his jacket was too fat and short to fit between the door and the frame. How to get out? He kicked the door. Ouch. "Come on, Gaby, help me." "What are you doing?" She was still looking at her computer. "Look at this." Her eyes were wide. He went to stand behind her so that he could see over her shoulder. Blue text scrolled over a black screen. "It's the sector traffic control log," she explained at his raised eyebrows. He read the conversation so far. The Everbright reported that they had several people with sudden and unexplained bone fractures. A report said, "One on the bridge just now. He went to press a button and his arm just shattered. We're without a head navigator." Just then a line of text appeared on the screen. "Asking for advice. Return to the station or proceed." "That's the Everbright," Gaby said. Jonathan nodded. Another line of text replied, "Were you cleared by quarantine?" "Yes." "No," Jonathan yelled. "White cleared them to get rid of them. They shouldn't have left. Tell them." She typed and cursed. "I can't. I can only read this. No one is replying to my other messages." The conversation on the screen continued. Station control replied. "Then proceed as normal. Notify Earth authorities on arrival." Jonathan groaned. Then he had an idea. "Gaby, can you get a message to Earth?" "Who are you going to contact there?" "My old professor, or my dad, anyone." "It will be night there. Try it anyway." She had just started typing when there was a sharp click and the door slid open. Into the room came Manuela. She was alone, still in her quarantine authority uniform. She put her finger to her lips. "Shh, quick, before those bullies find out. I waited for ages, until they were all gone." "What changed your mind?" Jonathan asked. "I thought you didn't believe me." "Looking you up didn't seem right." Jonathan followed Gaby out of the room. They ran down the passage until coming to the lift to the inner level. When the doors had closed, Manuela spoke again. "Also, that crew member with a broken leg died this morning. They contacted quarantine to assist with the transport of the body, and they were funny about all the questions I asked about how we died. They sent me a report, and I took one look at it and almost puked. It was so awful, like his whole skull had collapsed. Then I saw your message with the photos. I showed them to Major Kitchener. He was the highest-ranking Space Corps officer on the station, who, presumably, had the power to stop military ships leaving. And what did he say? He wants to speak with you immediately. Is that a good or a bad thing?" She didn't know the answer to that question. Chapter 15. Major Kitchener had been speaking to the station and base crew assembled in the canteen for the usual staff morning briefing. This was the only time that Jonathan had ever seen the man. His voice just died down when Manuela, Gaby, and Jonathan came to the door. People in the room started moving towards the door, giving Jonathan strange looks. A chill crept over his back. He had 2 years of his contract to go, and he'd already made more enemies than he could count on the fingers of both hands and his toes. "Ah, there you are," Kitchener said, when the bulk of the crowd was gone. He came across the room, his face humorless as always. "Thanks for standing with me," Jonathan whispered to Gaby. "I didn't do much. It was all your initiative, and you're not very popular right now." This was what it must have been like for his father. "I'm not sure I care a lot. We did the right thing." "Come and sit here for a moment." Major Kitchener indicated a table close to the door. Jonathan and Gaby sat next to each other. There was a kind of strange solidarity in the moment. Gaby might not have been willing to help him at first, but when he had put the choice of being stupid or a coward before her, she had chosen his side. At least, they would be dismissed together. "I just want to commend both of you for persevering with your message in the face of considerable adverse opinion." Jonathan said, "Thank you, sir, but I would be more happy knowing that the ship has been stopped." "It has. We've ordered it to park in lower Earth orbit. It can run on autopilot there forever, or at least until we can get medical personnel in to remove the crew." Again he couldn't restrain a shudder. He heard in the Major's voice that the Corps expected many of the crew to die. This had been the fate of at least half the people affected by the calciphages in the few reported cases. Even if the bone damage could be fixed, the organism's short lifespan led to piling up of dead organic material in the bones, and this led to infections. "What's going to happen to the ship?" he asked. "It will stay in orbit until we can be sure we've eradicated the disease," which was going to be pretty much impossible, but one could try. More likely was that the ship would need to be abandoned, or... "Is there a cure?" the Major asked Gaby. She shook her head. "At this point, there isn't." Jonathan shuddered to think of the ship as a giant flying sarcophagus. They already knew that the man with a broken leg had died. The remaining crew would either die as well, or turn out not to have been infected. "It's not pretty, but it seems your actions have prevented much worse." Major Kitchener drew something from the pocket of his jacket and gave it to Jonathan. His phone. There was a message on the screen from the Corps' General Lee. It said, "Ask that young man how we can entice him to join up. Bartells are a pain in the ass, but if the son is half as stubborn as his father, I want him. Ask him if he has any siblings. By the sound of this bungle, we're going to need a handful of Bartells out there." Jonathan met the Major's eyes. "So," the Major said, "what do you want in return for your joining the Corps? You would agree with me that you're wasting your talents in the Quarantine Authority." Jonathan looked at Gaby. "I want your guarantee that Dr. Larsen is not demoted or otherwise disadvantaged in her work for having helped me. I want my father to receive a full apology." He grew bolder. "What the heck?" "I want you to give Dr. Larsen a better placing too." The Major looked at Gaby, nodded. "Consider it done." "You didn't need to do that," Gaby said after the Major was gone. "No, but I could never have made the conclusions I did without you. I was a coward and I didn't want to help you. Because you were afraid that they would hurt you. I would have done the same had this happened to me in a month's time, after I'd become better acquainted with Cresswell and his mates. There will always be Cresswells. The whole Corps is full of Cresswells. Most Corps personnel are good. Most of them are too scared to stand up against the Cresswells. Then we'll just have to find more Bartells, right?" She looked at him and shook her head. "You're crazy, you know that?" Thank you for listening to Contamination. In the next installment of the series, Observation, Jonathan and Gaby go on their first assignment together. People joke about attacks of illness suffered by visitors to bases on the moon, but they soon find out that this is no joking matter on more levels than one. Find out about Observation and other books at the author's website pattyjansen.com.